Ladies and gentlemen, hello there. Welcome to our L24 special coverage of the Ukraine-Russia war, the so-called special military operation. Western weaponry shipments that have been flowing into Ukraine since spring are working very powerfully and starting to make difference on the battlefield. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his Wednesday night address, imposing very noticeable strikes on Russian logistical targets. But after weeks of fighting, outgunned Ukrainians have surrendered most of Lugansk, Ukraine's easternmost region, to the Russian forces, the area's governor said. On the other hand, the Kremlin's troops are also closing in on the Donetsk city of Slovyansk. Two U.S. lawmakers who have urged Washington to accelerate the pace of weapons deliveries to Kiev arrived in Ukrainian capital Thursday, where they are expected to meet with Zelensky. Elsewhere, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to Indonesia Thursday for a gathering of group of G7 or rather G20 foreign ministers, but will focus on food and energy security. A traditional one-on-one meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is not on the agenda, according to the State Department. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by Mr. Ruslan Bortnik, Director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics from Ukraine, and Mr. Alessandro Gagaridis, an Italian international security and geopolitical analyst from Italy. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And now, before we delve into our discussion, let's tackle this piece of information. Officials in Ukraine said on Wednesday that Russian forces were targeting cities and villages in the eastern Ukraine, with most civilian casualties occurring in Donetsk province. Russian shelling killed at least 8 people and injured 25 more. However, pro-Russia separatists said that other attacks by Ukrainian forces killed at least 4 civilians.
I'm going to evacuate my wife, and I have no choice but to join the army tomorrow.
Now the situation is deteriorating as heavy shelling has begun in Slovyansk and other cities.
Mr. Ruslan, starting with you now, the main focus of the battle in Ukraine is the eastern part of the country. Russian troops have taken full control of Lugansk region, and yesterday they have started to establish their bases over Donetsk, starting with the city of Slovyansk. So, as a director of a political institute, how can you read the moves made so far by the Russians? What Putin is trying to do now?
From formal side, hello colleagues, from formal side, Russia obtained half of her goal of second stage of special operations, so-called in Russia. They obtained all their territory of Lugansk Oblast of Ukraine, or so-called DPR. So, formally, Russia is going to continue their advances on the rest territory of Donetsk Oblast. But there are still unoccupied a very big agglomeration with 5 big cities in Donetsk Oblast, and I think there will be very heavy clashes in these cities. And it should be very difficult for Russia to obtain these cities. But we are talking on tactical level, of course. But on the strategical level, Putin is continuing his attempts to defeat Ukraine, to push Ukrainian government to capitulation. Russia is trying to, using their advances on the east of Ukraine, to like an instrument to push into Ukraine, to accepting all Russian demands, which was stated in the beginning in this war.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Coming to you, Mr. Alessandro, as an international specialist, I believe you are aware about the propaganda made during the wartime. So, which narrative is close to be true? Is Russia winning everything in the eastern part of Ukraine, or Ukraine still have something to say, especially when they got more weapons?
Well, of course, the narrative is determined by politics on both sides. So each side is trying to promote the vision it intends to. It matches more its own interests. That said, we can say that truth probably lies in the middle, as it often happens. So of course, Russian forces have been many troubles, much more troubles than initially expected and anticipated, including by Western analysts. But it's also true that now the war seems to be to have turned in a stalemate based on attrition. So here the key factor will be which side will be able to keep on fighting the longer. In this regard, probably the most likely scenario is that it will end, as I said, in a stalemate, and Russia will limit itself to take the eastern part and southern part of Ukraine, because it will not have many the force and the energy to keep pushing. But it's also possible that due to Ukraine's less limited capability to keep on fighting in the long term, including in spite of Western help, I wouldn't rule out the scenario that it will its military will at some point become less and less effective, thus enabling Russia to push for more. I don't anticipate a complete occupation of Ukraine because Russia also had very important losses, but we could see, I believe, more gains as the conflict continues.
Understood. Coming to you back, Mr. Ruslan, NATO, or rather let us say US, as Putin claimed, their main goal behind the last summit in Madrid is to focus over two things. First, to show the world that we are still united and even stronger with the newly applied Scandinavian countries such as Finland and Sweden. And secondly, to warn Russia of any other advanced thoughts to launch another military operation and to stop its operation in Ukraine. But as a Ukrainian, do you think it will work to push back the Russians from reaching their goals?
Great question. I want to discover two mistakes, two big political prejudices which are in political mind in the both sides of this war. The first mind is that if the Russia cut more and more Ukrainian territories, then Ukraine will capitulate in the future. I don't think so. Even if Ukraine will lose much bigger part of our territories and a much bigger part of our peoples, Ukraine will not going to lose in any case, because there is no Ukrainian government and there is no public opinion to support any compromise, any bad compromise with Russia. It's from one side. And from another side, there is also a mistake that sanction against Russia and the heavy losses from the leads to capitulation of Russia. Russia will go back to home. I think it's also a mistake because Russia continue, from Russian side, Russian opinion, Russia continue war with all the West, with NATO, with United States. Very global goal, very global competitor, and so there is no, I think, chance to, in nearest future, to change the position of Russia by the growing up their losses. Also, it leads only to very high mobilization of Russian opinion inside of Russia and additional attempts, economical, military attempts, Russia to broke situation for their goals. I think Russia is not going to defeat their goals, but Russia understands that these goals will not accept possible to obtain in the nearest future. This war become a war for exhausting war, where both of sides comparing not only the military possibilities but also economical, demographical, and other types of resources. This should be a very long, very very heavy war for the long time, and these resources should be much more important than even military.
Perfect. It's very good point you have raised, and we will come to the energy sources. Coming to you, Mr. Alexander, this question kind of is quite out of the list, but derived from what Mr. Ruslan has just said. Do you think that the eastern parts of Ukraine, that it's already have been taken by the Russians, do you think that Ukraine will gain it back after this war comes to an end? And don't you think that Ukraine should set up a diplomacy situation and solution with Russia, not to rely on the Western allies?
Well, that's a very good question and very difficult to predict. Even before the war, Russia has had a very important influence in these regions, and now it seems that currently they are lost, basically. I don't see a massive counterattack by Ukraine coming, at least not anytime soon, because of course war is costly in terms of human losses and economic resources on both sides, and Ukraine also had to pay its toll, and it has been able to defend effectively, well beyond expectations, but as time goes by, the situation will become more and more complex, and mounting a counteroffensive is also a complex endeavor. That it's not. It's easier said than done. That said, of course, diplomacy is in principle the best solution to try to solve the issue for the benefit of all. And but even so, I don't think that Ukraine will be able to do it on its own without Western help, because Western help is what it's enabling it to keep on fighting. At least, maybe it's not a determinant factor, but it's surely something that is playing a role, and it needs the West backing to be in a stronger position and obtain concessions from Russia.
Quite understood. Now, let's try to move on to the second point. Lithuania showed off a crowdfunded Turkish-made military drone, which it plans to send to Ukraine. Vilnius raised 5.9 million euros for the Barkaracha TB2 drone over the 3 days last month, before the Turkish manufacturer Baykar announced it would donate the drone free of charge. At a press conference, the Lithuanian defense minister said that weapon will be sent to Ukraine immediately after being presented to the public. Coming back to you, Mr. Alessandro, Russia president stated that he had never thought to take any step against Sweden and Finland because they have never been a threat to Russia. For him, it doesn't matter if they became members of NATO alliance or not, but if they open their lands for a NATO military brigades, then Russia will change its military and political procedures with the latter, especially Finland, that shares a long border with Moscow. So, to this point, can we consider this a threat or only a defensive statement? And what about Lithuania now? She's not this country, it's not a NATO member, but they are trying to be with these procedures taken.
It's interesting here to note how Russia's narrative changed over the time, because in the past it was clearly mentioning it would react in case countries in its neighborhood, so including Sweden and Finland, would join NATO. Now it seems it's softening its stance, which probably is also an indication of its difficulties it's facing on the terrain, saying that it wouldn't react just because they join NATO, but only if NATO forces are placed in these two countries. But from Russia's perspective, which is what motivated the war in Ukraine, after all, it is just a defensive measures to protect its national security. But here we are also talking about deterrence, which means dissuading NATO from placing forces in these in Sweden and Finland. And in this sense, deterrence is based on threatening, on imposing costs on an adversary in case of war. And in this sense, it can be considered as a threat, because that is what deterrence is based upon. As for Lithuania, first a small correction, because Lithuania is a NATO member, and actually, so I think they can feel safe that NATO will defend it and the rest of the Baltic republics in case Russia takes military measures against them.
Perfectly understood. Coming to you, Mr. Ruslan, Vladimir Putin last week, he kept saying that the NATO is not moving forward the Russian borders just like that. It's a US-made decision. Always has been and always will be. Because we are Russia, not Iran, not any other country. If they take us down, it means two birds with another stone. US, since the Cold War and even earlier, they think of us as a threat and an enemy, and they are using NATO alliance for their best interests. Is that true? Are the NATO countries has nothing to say but only to follow US orders?
It's a difficult question. If you remember the last NATO summit in Madrid, when Finland and Sweden was accepted into NATO, but we should remember that Ukraine wouldn't accept in NATO. The question about Ukrainian entrance to NATO in that summit even wasn't looking at this summit. But before 1 year ago, or even earlier, Ukrainian government said that Madrid summit of NATO should be the place when Ukraine should be accepted in NATO. So situation is also changing in different ways. But talking about the Russia-NATO negotiation, we should remember that Russia has a problem not only with the United States. Inside the NATO, there are countries which are more dangerous even for Russia. Their rhetoric is higher level, aggressive more to the Russia than United States. For example, Baltic countries, Great Britain, or Poland. This problem has a very deep historical roots and political roots, economical roots, and of course many countries, most of countries of NATO, they are looking on the United States. But many countries inside of NATO have their own reasons to conflict to Russia also. A very interesting position of Germany and France. They are also NATO countries, and from another side, from the European Union point, they are very negotiable to Russia. They are ready to talk, to lead the peace negotiation with Russia. But when they are inside of NATO, they are just not talking a lot, and they are leading behind the United States. It's very, very interesting.
Perfectly understood. Coming to you, Mr. Alexander, as a European, don't you really think that this war in Ukraine is really harmful only for Europe, and US is only pushing the escalation forward, and this war, it serves United States cause, which is first creating a united front against military rival Russia, and secondly, to weaken the EU economy, which is also a competitor to US economy. Another two birds with one stone. This is why they want the war to go as long as they want. And now we can see the consequences. Germany suffering, Italy as well in the field of economy. So what are you saying about this?
Well, for sure, the war brought some positive developments for the United States in the measure of its expansion and consolidating NATO, and even making the alliance be felt like necessary after years of discussions since the end of the Cold War. But saying that it only serves U.S. interests, I think it's excessive. And also it would mean assuming that America has full control on the situation. And in spite of America being the world's leading and only superpower and being very influential, it has not the control on the entire situation, so it cannot manipulate it as it wants. So I don't believe it is a deliberate policy of the United States to keep the war dragging on. And considering the European Union economy, as I said another time, it's true that Europe is also a competitor, but it's also a very important partner for the US. And for example, the attempts in the past to create a free trade agreement between the two sides of the Atlantic shows that at least there was in principle a willingness to cooperate. And let's not forget that a weaker Europe also means a weaker NATO, so something that is detrimental to America's interest. So as I was saying, yes, America has some advantages. It has tried to turn the situation to its advantage in concerning strengthening and expanding NATO, but the war as a whole, it's not just an American attempt or something that completely and only serves American interest.
Correctly understood. Now, let's move to the third point to be discussed. The Ukraine Restoration Conference was held in Lugano, Switzerland. The summit has been renamed the Ukraine Recovery Conference. This summit was the unique opportunity for Ukraine to share its recovery plan and engage with international allies to get and develop the best possible response to enormous challenges that Kiev is facing after more than 5 months of conflict. First suggestions in the summit was to fight corruption by digitalization of architectural, and construction fields. Then for the second step is to digitalizing the rest of major as well as custom, according to Ukraine's Prime Minister.
Here in Lugano, we have taken an important step on the long road to Ukraine's recovery. This opens up prospects for the future. There is a palpable willingness among all partners for a joint long-term commitment in the interests of the people of Ukraine.
We should create conditions when corruption will be impossible. So first of all is digitalization. So we digitalized many spheres in our country. First of all, investment sphere, constructing and architectural sphere. It's absolutely developed and digitalized, and it's make corruption in this sphere impossible, and many investors approved this before the war. Next steps, now we are working on the digitalization of all other spheres, beginning from the custom.
Mr. Ruslan, as a simple question, how can you consider this conference that talks of Ukraine's reconstruction while Ukraine is still in a deadly war against Russia? Isn't that a sort of contradiction?
It's very important conference, but it's not very easy to understand the real goal of this conference, because only for the first side, this is conference about the recovery of Ukraine. But it's not so, because all the sides understand that any recovery of Ukraine is impossible before the end of the war. In real talk, we should understand this conference is conference about Russian money, because a lot of Russian money, state money and private money are frozen in the West, Western banks. So I think the real goal of this conference is to prepare the ways to developing the loyal instruments, how to obtain this frozen Russian money, how to move them to Ukrainian recovery. And from Ukrainian side, nowadays we see a lot of claims to the international judges to give this money to Ukraine, to use this money to compensate the Ukrainian losses which Russia made during this war. So from the one side, it's about recovering Ukraine. From the other side, this conference about how to use Russian frozen money in the West.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Coming to Mr. Alessandro, as a geopolitical analyst in this field, how can you read this conference of rebuilding Ukraine while they are still in war, that it looks they are losing it, especially in eastern part? So what kind of reconstruction they are talking about?
Well, of course, reconstruction is necessary in all areas affected and destroyed by the conflict. So housing, infrastructure, the military itself, and of course there is a lot to do in this sense. But I interpret the conference, because you make a very good point. The war is still going on, and we still don't know exactly when and how it will end. So I mainly interpret the conference as another sign of Western support towards Ukraine, as a message, a political message that Ukraine and its people will not be left alone even after the war is over. And after all, it's also an opportunity, in speaking in a very blunt and, if you want, dark terms, because history shows that after wars and destruction, there is also room for economic development and investment. So it's also preparing the terrain in this sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, understood. Now, this question is both directed to you. It's been a couple months where the U.S. Marshall Plan of Reconstruction was proposed to Ukraine to use it. Do you think that Ukraine could make it through to regain its safety and stability with this project, Mr. Alessandro?
Sorry, could you please repeat 1 second? I had a bit of problem with sound.
I said it's been a couple months where the U.S. Marshall Plan of Reconstruction was proposed to Ukraine. Do you think this project will help Ukraine to regain its stability?
Well, in the immediate term, since the war is still going on, it will have limited effects. But supposing that at some point the war will be over, at that point, yes, it will help stabilize. But of course, much will depend on how the war will end and which part of its territory Ukraine will manage to retain after the conflict is over.
Mm-hmm. Understood. What is your comment on this, Mr. Ruslan, the Marshall Plan?
I would like to hope so. But it's not the first time talk about the Marshall Plan for Ukraine. The first time talk was in 2014, 8 years ago, when the war in Donbass started. And there also was a lot of talking about the Marshall Plan of Ukraine, about a lot of money for Ukraine, investigation and so on. But there will be nothing done in this. So I'm afraid that this dialogue and this talking about Marshall Plan will not be realized in practical life because Western countries for nowadays they have no such money, and they are not ready to give this money in the situation when the war is going on.
Lawmakers voted Wednesday to include natural gas and nuclear in the bloc's list of sustainable activities. The European Commission earlier this year made the controversial proposal as part of its plans for building a climate-friendly future, dividing member countries and drawing outcry from environmentalists as greenwashing. Mr. Alessandro, before the war in Ukraine started, And even the first months of this war, EU leaders were calling for the use of the new technologies and the green power and to end the use gas of petroleum products, so to protect the NATO. And now they are saying the opposite. We should work with nuclear energy and the gas. So how can you explain this contradiction? And can we say Putin is winning so far with his energy power?
Well, I can explain this with a simple one word, meaning pragmatism, because in the short term, especially, there is not an alternative, or at least a viable green alternative to using gas and nuclear energy. This explains the U-turn by European states and the Commission. The EU in general, basically. So it was basically, they were forced to adopt this measure, even though it means a U-turn and betraying the promises on reducing the dependency on gas and moving towards greener sources. Concerning Putin, of course, he still has some leverage in this sense, because we have seen hesitations from the part of European states in this regard.
Quite understood. I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. Alessandro, but I have been called to put an end for the discussion because we do have a limited time. Thank you, Mr. Alessandro, for your perfect explanation for the debate. Mr. Ruslan, thank you ever so much for participating with us. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here with us on L24 News. Take care and have a blessed day.